In just 1 month, Ukraine has scored victory after victory against Russia. Massive territorial gains are being made as Ukrainians take back what's theirs and crush the Russian forces. None of this is happening by accident. Ukraine has developed into a fearsome fighting force that combines innovation with brilliant tactics, resulting in liberations in key sectors of the front lines that are stopping Russia in its tracks. Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi, provided the details in a Facebook post on April 15th. Noting that Russia has launched a more intense series of assaults as part of its spring offensive. Syrskyi detailed how Ukraine is responding and what that response has meant for Russia. "We must seize the strategic initiative, thus we are conducting an active defense," Syrskyi declared before breaking the bad news to Putin. "Thanks to this, in March our troops regained control over nearly 50 square kilometers of territory that had been occupied by the enemy. Those gains are the results of a series of counter-offensive actions that have caught Russia off guard, as Ukraine focuses on retaking territory over which Russia only held a tenuous grasp with its infiltration strategy. Putin's plans have backfired. He thought he could use Russia's manpower advantage by sending in soldier after soldier to turn occupied sectors into grey zones. Putin was wrong. Ukraine has come roaring back, and it's making gains even as Russia attempts to ramp up the pressure during its spring offensive. Things wouldn't be so bad for Russia if Ukraine were making these gains on the back of months of Russian advances. But that isn't the case. The latest 50 square kilometers, or 19.3 square miles of territory liberation, comes off the back of a month where Ukraine retook even more land than that. After launching a series of counteroffensives in the south, Ukraine had regained about 300 square kilometers, or about 115 square miles, by February 20th. By the end of March, Syrskyi was reporting that Ukraine had retaken about 450 square kilometers, or around 185 square miles, from Russia, in a counteroffensive that seemed sweeping at first. It isn't. What Ukraine is doing is extremely strategic and focused on a handful of key sectors, as you'll discover if you keep watching the video. The key here is that Ukraine has seen back-to-back months of extensive gains against Putin's forces, and in March the territory recaptures were accompanied by a mind-bogglingly bad casualty rate for Russia. Al Jazeera reports that Russia suffered a new monthly high for confirmed casualties caused by Ukraine's armed forces in March. Ukraine says enhanced drone production made this possible. It's more complicated than that, but the headline figure is simple. 35,351 Russians were killed or wounded in Ukraine in the same month that Ukraine retook 50 square kilometers of its territory. That casualty rate represents a 29% increase over the rate from February, which shows us that something is changing in Ukraine. It's not just holding the line anymore. Ukraine is pushing forward using an active defense that is killing more Russians than ever before. Adding to Putin's woes is that Russia's recruitment rate isn't keeping up with its 2026 rate of attrition. Russia plans to recruit 409,000 soldiers by the end of the year. It's getting nowhere near that number. Right now, Russia has a daily average recruitment rate of 1,120, which Al Jazeera says will ultimately lead to it having a 65,000 soldier shortfall against its target by the end of 2026. That means fewer soldiers being cycled onto the front, and when Russia has fewer soldiers to defend the territory that it occupies, opportunities for yet more counterattacks open up for Ukraine. What we've seen in March is already impressive, but it may just be the start of something much bigger as Russia's manpower problems take hold deeper into 2026. So Russia is dealing with recruitment issues, record casualties, and Ukraine retaking large chunks of territory. Could it possibly get any worse for Putin? The short answer is yes. All of this is happening as Russia launches the grand spring offensive that is supposed to result in the collapse of the Donbass, and Russia stealing vast quantities of territory from Ukraine. Attacks have ramped up across the entire front as a result of this spring offensive launch. Russia is sending waves of soldiers in the directions of Konstantinivka, Lyman, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and toward the fortress belt of cities in Donetsk, as it follows the only strategy that Putin has ever had: throw cannon fodder at defenses until Ukraine breaks. Heavy fighting has also been reported in the Oleksandrivka and Pokrovsk directions, the latter of which is a city that Russia has claimed to have taken since as far back as December. Basic logic dictates that more assaults should add up to more territory being taken by Russia, but that hasn't been the case. What we're actually seeing across the front is a massive slowdown in the rate of the Russian advance. Business Insider highlights this, noting that Putin's forces were moving forward at a rate of about 12.9 square kilometers, or 5 square miles per day in March 2025. Fast forward a year and the rate of advance is a comparatively paltry 2.58 square kilometers, or 1 square mile per day. In other words, Russia's rate of advance has been slowed by a factor of 5 in just 1 year. And to apply a healthy dose of salt to the Russian wound, Ukraine has snatched away the momentum to achieve daily gains of 4.66 square kilometers, or 1.8 square miles per day, almost twice what Russia is gaining. What this all means for Russia is very simple. The launch of the spring offensive has been a complete failure. According to France 24, an assessment by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, smashes the final nail into the coffin of Russia's March 2026 campaign. When tallying Ukraine's advances against Russia's, March is the first month in 2.5 years where Russia's gains amounted to net zero. Ukraine is outpacing Russia. It's putting Putin to shame by launching a better and more effective offensive than Russia in the precise month that was supposed to mark the start of Russia's victory march. This isn't just humiliating for Putin, it's an outright catastrophe that should be showing him just how poorly his throw people at the problem until it goes away strategy works in the 21st century battlefield that Ukraine has created. What we're seeing now is that things are starting to shift in Ukraine's favor, and this is how it's happening. The obvious answer to how Ukraine is pulling all of this off against a Russian military that has a massive numbers advantage is drones. We could just say drones did it and be done with it, only there's a lot more to it than that. Still, drones are crucial. Do you remember those March casualty figures that we shared earlier? 35,351 Russian soldiers killed or wounded. According to Euromaidan Press, a staggering 96% of those casualties were caused by drones. Ukraine's flying and ground robots have been taking a massive toll on Russia's spring offensive, which is allowing Ukraine to hold its ground in the regions that Putin is targeting as it makes advances elsewhere. Incidentally, Ukraine's drone advantage is getting stronger. 2026 will see the UK send a bumper package of more than 120,000 drones to Ukraine, which will add to the millions of drones that Ukraine is building itself. The long-range drone aspect of the war isn't going any better for Russia. For a long time, in an area where Russia held a clear advantage, long-range drones have been used to wreak havoc on Ukraine's cities and infrastructure. Again, volume was key, as it has been on the ground for Putin. However, March represented another turnaround in that department. ABC News reports that March was the first month of the entire war in which Ukraine launched more long-range drones at Russia than Russia managed to launch at Ukraine. The disparity is significant: 7,347 Ukrainian drones versus 6,462 Russian drones. And to make matters even worse for Putin, Ukraine's new breed of interceptor drones, which take out Shahids for pennies on the dollar, helped Ukraine to score a near 90% interception rate against Russia's drones in March. Russia is launching fewer drones than Ukraine, and it's seeing less success with those drones than it has in months. And what this means is that March wasn't just catastrophic on the battlefield for Putin. Ukraine's growing focus on deep strikes means that it's whittling away at the Russian war machine from the inside. Inside Russia alone, 76 targets were struck by Ukraine's drones, including 15 facilities relating to Russia's oil refining sector. All of this is done to weaken Russia on the front, be that by destroying military assets in Russia, such as production facilities, or by snatching away the fuel that Russia provides to its troops and sells for a profit to other nations. So drones have been huge for Ukraine in March. But you probably knew that already. Whenever there is a discussion about how Ukraine has pulled off something spectacular against Russia, drones are usually one of the reasons why. But pay attention to what we just said there. One of the reasons. Behind the drone barrage, there is a lot more going on behind the scenes that has enabled Ukraine to make massive gains against Russia. But before we get deeper into that, there's a lot more where this comes from. If you're getting value from the military show, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. There was something in Sierski's words that should have caught your attention, beyond the 50 square kilometer claim. Sierski used the words active defense, and that term represents far more than many realize. Sierski himself gave us some clues as to why when he said, "We are countering Russian numbers with Ukrainian quality of combat operations, forcing the enemy to play by our rules and constantly postponing the deadlines for completing tasks." He adds that Ukraine has been using strikes against Russia's military and defense industrial complexes, both in Russia and in the occupied territories, to reduce Russia's offensive capabilities. Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov also spoke about the need for Ukraine to take the initiative and go on the attack earlier in 2026. Back in January, Fedorov said that Ukraine was going to focus on boosting Russia's killed-in-action rate, as he set a target of 50,000 irrecoverable casualties for Russia per month. That, combined with the systemic reform inside the Ukrainian military, would lead to a situation where Ukraine could take the initiative against Russia. That's what we're now seeing on the battlefield. But taking the initiative doesn't translate to Ukraine launching a sweeping counteroffensive across a front line that now stretches for 1,200 kilometers, or about 745 miles. Ukraine is being much smarter than that. The reason why it's made gains against Russia in both March and February is that Ukraine has taken a sector-based approach to its counter-attacking strategy. George Barros of the ISW tells Business Insider, "It's not accidental, it's not circumstantial. There are reasons for it," when describing how Ukraine has been degrading Russia's defenses in key sectors for months to set the stage for the counter-offensives that we're seeing today. What this tells us is that Ukraine has learned from the mistakes of the past. It's launched a counter-offensive against Russia before, back in 2023. That counter-offensive ultimately failed for several reasons, one of which was that Ukraine spread its forces too thin. Ukraine isn't making that mistake now. Instead, it's looking at areas where Russia has spread itself too thin and is countering there. The idea is simple. Russia's infiltration strategy, which it used for much of 2025, allowed it to claim territory, even when it had only managed to sneak a handful of troops into that territory. These small gatherings of defenses are what Ukraine is targeting now, and the results are plain to see. Where Russia is weak, Ukraine attacks, and it launches those attacks while maintaining a stalwart defense in the regions that Russia really wants to take. That defense inflicts massive casualties, which further weakens Russia, as Putin is forced to move troops around the battlefield before he's ready. Those unanticipated movements lead to more weakening and more opportunities for Ukraine to make gains. Alexandriivka, where Russia is now trying to launch attacks, was one of those sectors. Dnipropetrovsk is another, Business Insider points out. And even before we started hearing about Ukraine's counteroffensives in 2026, it was giving us hints about the type of strategy it would deploy. Heading to Kupiansk in the Kharkiv Oblast, Ukraine spent the end of December shattering an attempted Russian occupation of that city, rubbishing claims made by Putin and his cronies that Kupiansk had fallen in the process. That gave us some early insight into the strategy that Ukraine is pursuing now. It's allowing Russia to take territory in strategically unimportant areas, while Ukraine focuses on retaking key pieces of territory that actually have an impact on Russia's long-term plans. In Kupiansk, Ukraine destroyed Russia's attempt to project strength ahead of peace negotiations. Now in Alexandriivka and Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine is preventing Russia from building a buffer zone to protect its forces in Donetsk, as well as pushing back against an attempted Russian advance in Zaporizhia. This is a maturation in Ukraine's operational planning, and it shows us that Ukraine is getting better at both anticipating what Russia wants to achieve and countering in places that Russia can't defend. Business Insider says that Ukraine's Delta system, which is a huge cloud-based battlefield management system that lets Ukraine review real-time data recorded by drones and other units from the battlefield, is playing a huge role. Ukraine constantly gets its hands on up-to-the-minute intelligence that feeds into the planning of its operations. The maturation of Ukraine's approach can also be seen in its military command. We've already mentioned that Fedorov is working on overhauling Ukraine's military structure. Ukraine is shifting to a core system which improves coordination between units and aids operational planning. All of these changes are already being reflected on the front, and they're being accompanied by a new Ukrainian focus on mid-range strikes. Ukraine is hitting more targets in places like occupied Donetsk, as it's introduced a new generation of drones that fly further than FPV drones and don't cost as much as the long-range drones it already has. We mentioned Ukraine's targeting of Russia's air defenses earlier. That has a purpose too. The Kyiv Independent says that the period between June 2025 and March 2026 saw Ukraine carry out 429 strikes against Russian air defense systems. Those strikes set up the mid-range strikes we're seeing now. Ukraine uses these strikes to target Russia's ammunition depots and its Shahid drone storage units in the occupied territories. It's taking out command centers and troop gatherings, forcing Russia into a position where it's having to deploy frontline units that don't have what they need. That's been made possible because the air defenses that once protected Russia's infrastructure in the near rear have been taken out of the game, which creates safe aerial corridors that Ukraine can exploit to smash Russian logistics and supply lines. Ukraine's strategy is complex and requires a great deal of coordination. However, we can sum it up as follows. Ukraine is weakening Russia from the inside to create opportunities for the types of counterattacks that were seen in February and March. Now, are these counterattacks war-ending? No, but they're not supposed to be. Again, it's all about the active defense that Siersky mentions. Ukraine is taking territory and strategic positions that enable it to defend other sectors better than it would otherwise be able to. Take Donetsk as an example. Now that Ukraine has liberated the southern territories that Russia intended to use as a buffer zone, it can start funneling more soldiers north and into the Donetsk region. If Russia wants to counter that, it has to send soldiers who were previously destined for Donetsk to the south. Either way, Russia's attempts to advance in Donetsk are weakened because Ukraine took the initiative in a completely different sector of the battlefield. And there are other factors at play. Just when Russia might start to think that it has a handle on Ukraine's tactics, Ukraine finds new surprises for Putin. According to the Kyiv Post, Ukraine is now taking advantage of underground routes through which it's moving troops and military equipment. The outlet doesn't provide much more information than that, though we do know that Ukraine has invested in building networks of tunnels in the kill zones that it's created. Those tunnels were, and likely still are, being used to ambush Russian infiltrators. Perhaps now the underground network Ukraine has created is large enough to enable it to use the tunnels as logistical arteries. Russia would never have seen that coming. And that's the point. Speed and innovation have always been key advantages that Ukraine has held over Russia. As we speak, Ukraine is working to embed research and development into the military units that are actively fighting against Russia, the Center for Strategic and International Studies claims. It adds that Ukraine has also created a better training pipeline for its air defense operators, which all adds up to Ukraine using its technological advantage to hurt Russia. Siersky himself says that Ukraine's military never stands still. Every month, Ukraine's military conducts assessments of the combat operations that it launches, which it uses to refine its tactics and figure out how it can improve coordination across all levels of military command. In short, Ukraine is always looking for ways to get better. Putin would have been happy with waging a war using decades-old tactics. Even now, Russia is having a hard time adapting. Yes, it's using drones against Ukraine, but beyond that, Russia is following the same attritional playbook in 2026 as it was in 2022, and the strategy is starting to fall apart. So when we say that Ukraine retaking 50 square kilometers of territory from Russia is an unbelievable victory, we aren't just referring to the territory itself. That's important, of course, but far more vital for Ukraine is that these gains are being made as a result of the country's ability to constantly adapt and mature. Putin's invasion, as brutal as it has been, has led to Ukraine becoming one of the world's strongest military powers. The bite back is now underway. Ukraine has the momentum as it claws back territory and destroys Russian soldiers in record numbers. The spring of 2026 was supposed to kickstart the final push for a Russian victory. Instead, it's starting to look like the beginning of Ukraine ending Russia's invasion for good. It's not just us in Ukraine saying that either. As Russia's losses mount, Putin is becoming increasingly detached from reality, even as the Kremlin warns that the situation on the front lines is critical. In the end, Putin's delusion may combine with Ukraine's evolution to spell the end of Putin's Ukraine dream, and you can find out why if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss our analysis of the latest developments in Ukraine. And thank you for watching.